All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you guys for joining today. My name is Luke Kramer. Years ago, I worked with the Star Coalition and helped develop some of the programs and so forth. I have moved on to get into the clinical research field, but obviously, we still got great leadership at the Star Coalition with Erica and Maria. Xavier, thank you so much, Maria. She really helped coordinate this meeting today and bring us all together. So thank you so much for all the work you've done. But I'm telling you, this is going to be an exciting topic because we are starting to see an explosion in psychedelics when it comes to clinical research. And here we are with a lot of our STAR certified sites, and we have others on the call today. But I know that this is something that a lot of sites are maybe looking at to integrate within their portfolio. And so today we have put together a really great panel to really kind of get into the nuts and bolts of what are some of the challenges that have come up when doing this. What are some logistics that have kind of put you can also put a few stoppers in getting this thing going, all the way to bringing in a sponsor to kind of give an idea of, well, what's next? What are we looking at in the future of psychedelics, and what's the landscape right now? So I think we've got an incredible amount of information in a great group today. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. A couple of things real quick. If during the discussion today, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them on the chat. We would love to get to some of those as we get towards the end. If there's any interesting topics you want to know a little bit more about, please put that in there. Really ready to get started, so I don't want to waste any more time. Today, we've got some incredible folks, as I said, and I'll introduce a couple of them right now. Dr. Scott Fisher, he's a psychiatrist and a lead facilitator and clinical program manager at the Center for Psychedelic Research at Siegel Trials in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, which I'm sure the weather is much nicer there than sweeping over the northern part of the US right now. But he's worked on trials exploring the use of psychedelics such as LSD, psilocybin, DMT, methadone, 5-MeO-DMT for indications such as generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, major depressive disorder, really a lot of the scope within the mental health system. So he holds a certificate in psychedelic assisted therapy from the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is passionate about the intersections of spirituality and mental health, mind and body, and the individual and community, and especially art and science. He is I'll tell you, is one of the leading folks in this field. He's been doing this for a long time, and I'm excited to hear him speak today. We also have Haley Gilmore with us. She's a master's level biostatistician. She has over 15 years of experience in clinical research oversight, and she's contributed to the life cycle of more than 60 clinical trials and is a co-author of over 30 publications, and with talks spanning several therapeutic areas. But the nexus of health, justice, and impact is the ethos for the work that she chooses. So after spending 11 years managing NIH-funded HIV clinical trials in the US, South America, and Africa, including multiple regulatory approvals of drugs and devices, she's transitioned into working into psychedelics. So since 2020, Haley has worked at the intersection of clinical operations and medical affairs for Lykos Therapeutics as a private consultant, and now for Atai Life Sciences, a really great company doing some incredible things. She manages KOL relationships and psychedelic trial sites in the US, Canada, Europe, Australia. And so her thoughts on psychedelic clinical development and rollout have been featured in Psychedelic Alpha and on the Trip Report podcast. So she's got a great background she's going to share with us today. And finally, we have Morgan Heckler. So Morgan is a dedicated clinical research professional with over 7 years of site-level experience as a clinical research coordinator, specializing in CNS studies with a strong focus on Alzheimer's disease and psychiatric disorders. She currently serves as the clinical trials manager at Excel Eye Research in Atlanta, great place, great people, where she leads and supports complex clinical trials with a commitment to quality, efficiency, and patient care. So prior to her role at Eye Research Atlanta, Morgan worked with the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at Emory University, and she contributed to cutting-edge research in neurodegenerative diseases. She holds a bachelor's degree in neuroscience from Vanderbilt University and brings both scientific expertise and operational insight to her work in advancing medical research, which that is a key piece in integrating these type of studies into your portfolio, into your sites, is really understanding that operational insight. So I'm looking forward to what Morgan has to say. Well, you didn't come to hear me talk the whole time. You came here to talk to these wonderful experts. So I really want to jump right in. And first, I want to start with you, Haley. I know that you've got some information that you want to share with folks, but I'm really interested in kind of hearing your perspectives of, psychedelics, where we are, where we're going. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Luke, and thanks to Star Coalition for having me here. I was tasked with sort of, laying out where we are in the space, in the market. I was going to put a couple of cartoons on the first slide, I like to start off with a laugh, and then I consulted my friend Josh Hardman, and he said, well, maybe you do the bullseye. So I'm sure a lot of people have already seen this bullseye. It's on Josh's website, put together by Michael Hyken, who's an amazing pharmacologist and just really synthesizes a lot of information on behalf of Psychedelic Alpha. And so I think, you're not gonna be able to read all the details on this this tiny screen here, but if you go to the website, you can view a much larger version of this, psychedelicalpha.com. And this is really just to show how many projects are going on in this space right now, in how many different therapeutic areas, as well as how many different drugs, how many companies are out there trying to get this work done. And which I think speaks to, there's a supply and a demand side, right? So there's a lot of trials that need sites, and there's a lot of sites that want to get into the space. So I think that, just putting out a little bit more knowledge like this webinar is going to do about how to best get into these trials, how to best prepare for these trials, there is a lot of opportunity. So I want to assure people, I think, come with this sense that like, oh, I've come too late, like it's sort of already happening, and we're kind of at the very beginning, right? Like this has been this space for the last 5 years has been maturing. It's been focusing, it's been zooming in on the center of this target, right? So I think the target actually moves outwards, but if you think about the way that we're really focusing as an industry and getting better and figuring out what those parameters are that need to be seen by regulators, this really is just the beginning. It's just setting the tone. And so there still is a lot of opportunity. No one's missed the boat. We also have a lot of work to do. Next slide, please. So this is a super messy slide, but that's because preparing for clinical research is super messy. As we know, there's a lot of pieces, a lot of moving parts generally at all given times. So I tried to break out, from my experience, again, I built out the IIT program for Lycos. And so I got to see a lot of those dosing rooms across the world. I worked with probably 4 dozen teams trying to launch psychedelic clinical research as IITs. When I was working in that role. And then I became an MSL. So then I was touring sites of care as we looked toward commercialization. So I tried to group like what are the predictors of success in this space into 3 different buckets: people, infrastructure, and then knowledge, access, and experience, which maybe that's too much of for one bucket, but it is just a lot of things to consider. So, I think that Morgan's going to get into maybe some more of the site level qualifications, and Scott's really going to speak to what it's like to be in the room with someone when they're having an experience like this. So again, we're looking at this from a big operational perspective. There does have to be a lot of different roles at the site. You have to have a PI. It's got to be one that's on site. I know a lot of PIs are managing a lot of different sites, but these trials are very intensive. People are having intense experiences a lot of the time. So PI involvement is something that sponsors, when they're choosing sites, are really going to look at. You need to have folks that are going to be raters. There are the people that will be sitting in the room. So the facilitators, they do have certain qualifications, and those aren't qualifications that have been set forth by industry. Those are qualifications that have been agreed upon with the FDA. So those aren't exactly wiggle room. You do have to have that licensed person in charge. So for the assistant, there can be a little bit of wiggle room on their background. There's a lot of procedures around PK. We're still kind of in a new class of drugs. So collecting the data on pharmacokinetics for the FDA is really important, and safety as well. There's lots of blood draws. There's lots of EKGs. There's really intensive lab processing, which if sites are kind of on that, maybe phase 1 end of the spectrum, they've had a lot of experience with, but just making sure your lab is up to snuff. I probably don't have to tell this group that your rockstar coordinator is the best asset you're going to have for making sure that all of these complex procedures happen in wonderful orchestration. If this is your first time trying to get into a trial, maybe reach out and try to find a mentor, because I do think that sites can learn from each other. Sites do learn from each other, especially if you're part of a network. I know the CenXL network is on here. like talk to your sister sites, wonder what they're doing, and lean into their best practices. Something that we do see with the mental health space, I think because there's not been, so much innovation or new therapeutic opportunities in the mental health space, particularly around depression, PTSD, is that trial sites they may have a CNS background, maybe Alzheimer's, ADHD, schizophrenia, but they haven't really worked with the kind of populations you need access to for these studies. Um, like treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, these are very serious mental health conditions, right? And so if that's not a therapeutic area you've worked in, developing those relationships where you're going to be able to get folks in the door who are qualified, who do meet those very specific criteria. PTSD is very specific, TRD is very specific. I think that goes a long way, because otherwise you're kind of starting from scratch in terms of your access to the population. Probably people have seen, or you're already working on this next one, which is really making your space amenable to these kind of studies. We said at Lycos that probably 150 square feet could accommodate everything you needed to do. I've been to clinics in New York City, which are very small, so I don't think they have 150 feet that they're working with. But you definitely need to make it cozy for the participant. There's lots of suggestions here about how you do that. I think there's actually this whole kind of emerging industry at this point of interior decorators who specialize in these kind of rooms. So I'm sure if you just Googled it, like psychedelic dosing room consultant, I think there's people actually working on this and selling their services for it. But here's a starter list for you. Some things I think people don't think about are the curtains in the room. Definitely no overhead lighting. You want to make it, again, soft and cozy. Many trials require that you cover the mirror. If people are staying overnight, do you have shower facilities? Can you retrofit a bathroom to get into a way that's accommodating for people who are going to have very long experiences if you're not already, again, on that phase 1 site spectrum? Having a secondary space because the day is long, where they're not in that single room the whole time. I mean, just think about how you would experience having to stay in one room all day. Maybe have like a lunch space or just another place where they can go to journal. And then obviously, I think the thing I get asked about the most is the DEA. The DEA has a manual for researchers that's on their website, for Schedule 1 researchers, I should say. It's really kind of clear what their requirements are. Again, the diversion agents, this is a new book of work for them. They are diversion agents. They're not necessarily paid or trained or primed for inspecting clinical research sites. So there are really kind of reproducible guidelines about what kind of safe you need to have, how that safe needs to be secured, what kind of access that room needs to have. So again, talk to your sister sites maybe that have already done it, but there is a fair amount of guidance already out there that's pretty public about what that all entails. The last bucket being just the kind of knowledge that you need to have in your staff and expertise you need to have, either as a PI yourself. It really, if you've never done a scheduled drug trial before, there is a big difference between just a regular, another Me Too drug and a scheduled drug trial. And then there's a Schedule 1 trial, right? So there is increasing levels of how much all of this GCP, CFR, documentation stuff really matters. That like we all kind of take our GCP course, we know how to do proper error correction, but so much of it is so much more under scrutiny in these kind of trials because we're in this new class of drugs, right? So making sure that you have the duplicative records, nothing is kind of like, you're not using an online Excel spreadsheet. Things have to be audited and verifiable to that highest level, right, of CFR. Definitely having experience in ketamine or other non-ordinary states of consciousness is something that sponsors are looking towards. These are very unique experiences. I think I've said that several times now. I'm sure you guys know that, and I can't drive it home enough. But then it's sort of this chicken and egg thing. People wonder, well, if I have to have psychedelic experience, but someone has to work with me for me to get that experience, then like, how do we cross that barrier? And that's where I come in with maybe try an investigator-initiated trial. And maybe that's just because that's the soft spot of my heart. I helped launch a lot of those with MDMA when I was at Lycos. But really showing that you can take that legwork on of figuring out how to build out that space. If you're an IIT site, I can tell you IIT sites that I helped set up with Lycos, they got chosen by sponsors afterwards. So it's actually a great way to break into the space. It might seem daunting, but again, if you've got a mentor, you've got a really strong staff, consider going that route. Having good relationships, obviously, with CROs, IRBs, knowing how the FDA application process works, which you can get a very intimate look at if you decide to do an IIT. It's all about working together. As we know, these can be really sequential submissions, but understanding what each of those agencies have purview over, because they do defer to each other on certain things. Like the DEA will defer to the FDA will defer to the IRB. So understanding what you need to demonstrate in each of those applications. State controlled substances offices are increasingly starting to augment their requirements, I'd say. It's kind of in the most like maybe negative interpretation, like there's money to be made now that there's this proliferation of these trials, like states at a state level can regulate them, and it does bring in additional revenue for the state to create these additional processes. I think we just saw that most recently in Alabama around ketamine, like adding a state level certification in. And so making sure that you have your state level license, which are newly being created kind of all the time, in addition to your DEA, and just making a good relationship with that office. I think that Morgan's going to speak a little bit more to like the internal systems, database, and scheduling. So I'll just end on the getting past the hype. Like if you can kind of see this down at the bottom, it's a figure from a famous article in the psychedelic space about the hype cycle. And kind of after the Lycos non-approval, we fell into, if you see on here, the trough of disillusionment, and now we're on the slope of enlightenment. Uh, and we're kind of crawling out of maybe some unrealistic expectations the industry had at the beginning to kind of level off into a mature industry. But participants have been really primed to have a really phenomenal experience. And so expectation and bias come into play there around what they think is going to happen in that room. And so that's also kind of a soft skill that people really need to train around, having role plays around, having conversations around how do you consent someone to something like this, where the placebo may not be as effective as it has been in other trials. And how do you manage participant expectations and potential disappointment? So I don't know if maybe that actually goes under the people column, but it's an experiential column. So that's where I put it. Yeah, and I'm available for questions after.
Thank you, Haley. Wow, you had some really incredible points. It is true. It seemed like several years ago, this expansion into psychedelics, as everybody wanted to get in the game. And then there was this real contraction, like, oh my gosh, limited resources, the funding was all going crazy, but then it contracted. But now you're right. It seems like we're on a really good direct path towards taking a very scientific, deep, thoughtful approach to how psychedelics can be a tool to be used to help people in their recovery. And so it is an exciting time. And it does feel like the beginning, because this is the time to really get involved. It's so funny talking about qualified patients. I think that we just assume that everybody who wants to sign up is going to get into the study. But look, the protocols are pretty strict. You have to be very aware of how will that person interact with that particular compound while they're in a particular study. And there's a lot of work that goes into before that dosing day, which we'll get into. And one thing we've noticed, even working with the DEA and the state level, they want to work with sites. This is a learning experience for them. So if they come in and maybe you don't have that, you don't have that med kit locked down completely, they're going to work with you to make sure that happens. So don't be too intimidated by that. And I know Scott and Morgan are probably getting that as well. But I think that idea of working together, I've seen so many times site reach out to other sites or really work with the sponsors on how can we make this successful. And everyone is really trying to work lockstep, because we are learning a lot right now. But thank you so much. Wonderful. And again, if you guys have some questions, especially kind of from the sponsor side and a little bit about kind of where we are again with the infrastructure and moving forward, please drop those into the chat and we will get to those in a bit. But I do want to move over to Dr. Fisher. So Doc, I know that you have been helped facilitate many studies, and I know that it's a topic that how do sites approach it from this area? What are those challenges? So can you tell us just a bit from your perspective at Siegel's? And Siegel Trials was one of the very first kind of private sites to go in and really integrate psychedelics. They've been doing it for years. And so you're bringing a lot of experience into this discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to you to give us some of your insight and wisdom.
Okay, thanks so much, Luke, and thanks for the Star Coalition as well for having me. Um, It's such a broad topic that, I'll try and keep my comments short because I could really just go on for hours and hours about this, and I'm really more interested in knowing what people on the call want to learn about. From the site perspective, we get a lot of interest for these studies. Psychedelics are a very sexy topic. Many people who would probably never be interested in doing a clinical trial are interested in doing a psychedelic clinical trial. You're often getting a higher SES kind of group of people compared to a lot of our other clinical trials. And that can be an opportunity and a challenge, I think, for sites to adjust to the different kind of SES population that you're getting. And also a population that is probably a lot more educated about the investigational products than they would be about other sorts of kind of investigational products. There's a lot of information out there about psychedelics. Humans have been using them for thousands of years. There's many ways to access these psychedelic drugs aside from getting them in clinical trials. So we get many people interested in these studies who get excluded because they've already microdosed psilocybin or, something like that. So there's it's actually a lot of interest, but very hard to find someone who really fits the niche that the inclusion exclusion criteria have for most of these studies. So we're screening out a lot of people at the pre-screen. And then the screen fail rates are very high for a lot of these studies. Sometimes between 40 and 80%, and there's a phase 3 study that we're working on right now that has a screen fail rate of it was in between 70 and 80%, which is extremely high. Scheduling is also something that can be a challenge. There's a lot of visits, maybe not a lot more than other clinical trials, but some of the visits are really long. The dosing days, they're there the entire day. You have 2 or 3 dosing days. You're working with people who are often employed or have a lot of responsibilities. So scheduling often becomes a big issue as well. From the facilitator perspective, I mean, I would say pretty easy to find people who meet the kind of bare minimum credentials that are asked for in terms of having someone who's licensed to perform psychotherapy in the state. That's usually a master's level, a PhD level, or an MD like myself. Um, and then an assistant therapist or DSM who's got bachelor's level and usually about 1 year of experience in mental health. Um, but there's such a range of what can happen in the dosing sessions. I mean, I would say the majority of dosing sessions I've, worked on, honestly, they're pretty easy. Not a lot happens in a lot of the dosing sessions. Maybe 50% of people are getting placebo and they kind of sleep or they're a little disappointed or, I would say there's a minimum amount of time where you really need a lot of expertise. But some of these studies are giving, really high doses of psychedelics. I think it's worth people knowing these don't tend to be microdosing studies. These are big doses, and some of them are really big doses. So people can become very altered and then very unpredictable. Our site is really lucky in that we haven't really had any serious adverse events happen during dosing sessions, at least. But I've heard so many stories of just wild, wild things that are happening that you probably wouldn't tend to see, at least in other studies of depression, anxiety, PTSD. People can uh, become agitated. There's, reports of people who've broken everything, all the decorations in the dosing room and lacerated themselves during the dosing. There's people become sexually stimulated. They remove their clothing. They're sexually acting out. They try and leave the site. Um, I had a participant once who every dosing session, she would repeatedly invite me to lie in the bed with her during the dosing session. There's just all sorts of things that you need a therapist, I think, who's got, a fair amount of experience working and has some kind of equanimity in being able to work with these different sort of challenging things that may come up. Most of the time they don't, but they may. And who's very open-minded and who perhaps already has some experience kind of training in psychedelics or an interest in psychedelics. Because otherwise, you might have challenges in managing some of the serious adverse events that can happen as a result of some of these altered states of consciousness. So, I'll probably just put a pin in that there, and happy to answer kind of any other questions that come up regarding kind of the facilitator role or the clinical program manager role that I've worked here at Siegel. Been very fortunate to work on.
Fascinating. Yeah, the challenges are very unique. Right. I mean, this is you're totally going in a different direction. It was interesting how you mentioned how a lot of people do come in with knowledge about the psilocybin or 5-MeO DMT, as opposed to just a psychedelic compound for major depressive disorder. I mean, not knowing what are they taking. So there is this expectation, and they do come in sometimes a little versed. And I do find it ironic. It seems like the only trials all the staff want to participate in. But it's like the minute you start talking about psychedelic trials, people are always like, "Well, how do I get involved?" But there is. I mean, like you said, this isn't just anyone can be included. There are some very specific criteria to protect that patient, to protect that individual participating, to make sure that the staff, there's not a lot of unknowns are happening before you get to that dosing day. So like you said, the intensive side, which I think will move beautifully into what Morgan's going to talk about. Look, one of the biggest challenges I think we've seen, Morgan, and I'm going to pull up your slides here to give us additional information. But this can be a very challenging types of studies to coordinate. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts to this, and whether we talk about recruitment or whether we talk about finding those co-facilitators and scheduling these things. So I'm looking forward to you kind of sharing from your perspective what have been your challenges, and what would you expect maybe some of these sites to have challenges with as they move forward in these type of trials? But thank you, Morgan, for being here. And can you see your slides okay?
Yes, I
Okay,
can. Thanks,
perfect.
Luke. And I'm really excited to be part of this talk today. I did want to make one quick correction at the beginning. I'm not from Excel Research. I'm with SunExcel. I research Atlanta, which is now more widely known as SunExcel Decatur. So I am a part of that network and grateful to be a part of it. We did not have as many connections with the network when we first started psychedelic research. And I will say I was managing our screening and recruitment at the time when we started our first trials, and it was a bit daunting. So I can appreciate how a lot of other sites probably feel when they think about getting involved. But I think sometimes it's one of those things where you just need to decide to build it, and more likely than not, they will come. So I am going to touch more specifically on what I think are probably the two most daunting pieces of getting involved in psychedelic research, but I'm happy to answer questions about other specific areas towards the end. I know the first step with everything is recruitment, and I think more so even than other trials, the recruitment process for the psychedelic trials is the most important piece, because you really need to help the potential patients understand what they might be getting involved in. We definitely go for a more broad outreach approach at the very beginning. So social media ads and working with recruitment vendors is a great idea. It's going to bring you in a lot of numbers, and I think as Scott and Haley both mentioned, there's not going to be a lack of interest in those, especially once you put it out that you have it. So you're going to get a lot of interest right away. You can also work directly with some local healthcare professionals, especially if you already have connections to psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists. They more than likely are going to have a few patients right offhand that they think might be a great fit for your trial, and then that will also help you with that screening process and making sure they're appropriate for the trial. But beyond bringing them in, you're going to really need a comprehensive pre-screening process to make sure that you're getting the right patients into the trials, because there are a lot of exclusions that you have to pay attention to. So our recruitment team, we're very lucky that prior to starting these trials, we had built them in such a way that they're very well trained to pick out whether a patient might present with possible suicidal ideation, which is typically a big exclusionary factor, or other comorbid psychiatric disorders that are not allowed in the trial. And then, of course, most importantly, making sure they actually have the indication for the trial that it's looking for. So it might be depression, it could be anxiety disorder, and you want to make sure that the patient actually falls under that criteria. Some additional assessments that you might want to include in that pre-screening process are going to be checking the vital signs, doing a urine drug screen, and getting BMI measurements, because you don't want to, once you actually screen fail for something that you could have caught early on. And those are really easy factors that you can pick up on. I do want to just throw out there that if you're going to do all of this pre-screening, you probably need to have a pre-screen consent, some sort of language that covers you to do all of those assessments. And then, of course, the second big piece, and possibly the most daunting, is scheduling. I want to touch on the fact that early on, you should bring up that schedule with the patient. So before you even consent them to the trial, you're trying to figure out if this is a good fit for them. You want to talk about how involved that schedule is, especially because of the fact that some of these patients are and participants are from a higher socioeconomic status. They're probably working full time, and their schedules are going to be a little bit more difficult to work with. So we present that during our first intake with the potential participants and just make sure that they're aware for what they're signing up for. And then we also dive into that double-blind possibility of placebo discussion. And it is a very important discussion to have. We definitely, because of the level of education on these substances, have a lot of patients coming in very excited to trip. And that's one of their first questions. And we have to be very honest about the fact that that might not happen for them. And we try to approach it as explaining the benefits to future research, the benefits to their future access to these as a treatment, as motivation to still participate, even though they might not have that experience. But on the other side, we also want them to understand that they may have that experience, and are they actually going to be comfortable going through that with other people that they're not close to and don't necessarily have a long-term relationship with in the room. So we try to prepare them as much as we can and make sure that they are ready for that process. Beyond that, once we start the screening process, ideally for us, as soon as that screening visit is over, we actually lay out the entire schedule of prep sessions, dosing day, and integration sessions, and go ahead and tentatively schedule that with them for days that work within the screening window for the trial, as well as for their schedules, so that they already have that laid out and they can put it in their calendars, so that if they end up eligible, it's not a problem and we can all maintain that schedule. And that allows us to also go ahead and schedule facilitators for the patient. So early on, it was a pretty simple approach, and we tried just sending texts to our facilitators that we had available saying, hey, this is when the patient is planning on dosing, and here are the preparation sessions. Will that work for you? And as we got more and more patients in those trials, that process broke down, and it became very difficult to maintain. So we created a live scheduling spreadsheet, and what you see on the bottom of the slide here is a little snippet of an example of what that could look like. So we would just list out the patient ID and then all of those sessions for the entire trial, prep sessions, dosing, and integration, and what those dates would be. Then we would tag the facilitators and let them know, hey, there is a new patient on the spreadsheet. Please go on there and see if this is something you can commit to. And the understanding that we have with our facilitators is if they assigned themselves to a patient, they were agreeing to that entire schedule. And that as soon as they knew that they might not be able to make a session, they needed to reach out to us right away so that we could try to adjust if we were able to. We also had that commitment from our facilitators that they would help with scheduling future sessions. So the primary coordinator and or the screening coordinator, in our case at my site, we do have a dedicated screening team, would set up those initial baseline prep and dosing sessions, especially if they were remote. And then moving forward, the facilitator would work with the patient to determine times and days that would work out and within window to do those sessions. Now we are actually working on transitioning to a project management platform called Monday. So we're hoping to have it set up as more of a calendar, and it would work in a similar way to the spreadsheet. It would just be more operationally efficient, and it also allows us to set up automatic reminders for the sessions that go out to the facilitators a few days beforehand so that they are in the know and then immediately know if maybe they need to change something last minute, they can reach out to us. So we're really excited about that. We think it's going to make everybody's lives a whole lot easier. Other than that, a few final notes. I do want to say with regards to adverse events, there's a lot, most protocols for these trials have very specific umbrellas of AEs, especially those that may be associated to the patient's experience during a dosing session. And they typically will have a list of symptoms that they consider to fall under that umbrella. So just pay a lot of attention to that when you're going into these trials, and work with your medical team to make sure they're well versed because we did, you know, with our initial trials, that was a little bit of an obstacle and a hurdle we had to go over. It wasn't something we were as familiar with, so we had to train our medical team on that, as well as having a standard documentation process for the facilitators while they're with the patient, to take notes on what the patient may be experiencing, so that they can then review that with the medical personnel afterwards to determine if there are any adverse events that are reportable. But that is it for me. Thank you guys so much for the opportunity.
Wow, it sounds like you guys are putting in a really great system in place, especially Monday.com is a great program. But to that seems to be a big challenge. Look, you have a patient, you have many, sometimes you have many appointments that you have to do over sometimes a several month period. But it's not just the patient, it's those facilitators. And a lot of times they're therapists that have their own private practice, they have regular schedules with their patients. And so you are really having to juggle quite a few different people to land them into those scheduling appointments. And it can be quite challenging. And so I really love the fact that you guys are kind of doing an online service or something to throw that out. Hey, we've got a patient and here's their schedule. Which one of you guys are able to plug in, commit, let's go. And then you're able to work those through. That's a really great idea, because that does tend to be a big challenges for coordinators. So thank you so much. We've got some really great questions. As a matter of fact, if you don't mind, I'd kind of like to stay on the facilitator question, maybe something Morgan or Dr. Fisher and even Haley, if you've got. So, it's interesting. How do you find co-facilitators? Sometimes there are groups on Facebook or others, psychedelic, groups that a lot of times professionals will get together. But it seems like when you find one, you find 10, right? Because they're all kind of working together in their communities as therapists. But it is interesting, how do you own these full-time facilitators? Do you contract with them? And do you have staff that you can actually send through sometimes pretty extensive training by the sponsors? And I know there's some other certifications that you can get. But how do you pull these type of folks into this trial, either externally or internally? How does that kind of work? I think that's a great question. And I don't know if Morgan or if anybody else would like to answer that.
I can definitely take a stab at the initial answer. I'll say we've done both ways. We did at one point in time have one full-time facilitator. The downside to that is if you go through any lulls in psychedelic trials, you're then having to find other tasks or departments that they can assist with, and that can sometimes be difficult based on their skill level in other areas. So we have found that having contracted facilitators is more effective, and just trying to give them a sense of how many participants per month there may be available for them to work with, so that they have an expectation there. And from there, it comes with a first come, first serve basis. So when we send out that message and say, are you interested in this patient? The first person that jumps on it is the first person that gets it. Most of our facilitators have come from connections through providers we already had. So because we have done so many other clinical trials that weren't psychedelics, but lots of psych and CNS, we had relationships with other psychiatric professionals, and they put out their feelers and brought in colleagues of theirs that were super interested. But you're very right. As soon as one comes in, there are many more that are interested because they all tell their friends and other people they work with. One other thing with what Haley pointed out is that most trials will allow your secondary or assistant to be an unlicensed person that has a bachelor's degree and experience in the field. And that is something that is helpful to take advantage of, to have maybe 2 or 3 of maybe an RA or a member of your CRC team that isn't on the trial per se, but is on the trial for that role. It does help with scheduling so that you always have a couple backup and assistant roles that you can choose from on site.
Fabulous. Scott, any other additions to that? I know that there was a question also that kind of wrapped into that. Is there going to be a time that maybe you have facilitators that are non-clinical staff? I mean, is that an option? I know that nurses or even just folks that may just have outside of the scope of having a clinical license.
No, not too much to add. I think Morgan gave. I think just really being aware of you'll probably need at least a couple, 2, 3, if you're starting on one study, licensed mental health clinicians available, and then, a backup person who could have a non-clinical background. But, a lot of the studies, they used to have two people in the room at once. Now, many of the studies, they allow just one, like the licensed person to be in the room, while the person with the bachelor's, the non-clinical, is in another room watching kind of on a baby monitor or something like that. And a lot of times that person could be doing other work, honestly, while they're just sort of keeping an eye on the baby monitor, whether they're doing pre-screens, like sometimes happens at our site, or doing other sorts of clinical kind of site-related work.
It's interesting because you're right. Some of these dosing sessions could be 4 hours to 12 hours. I mean, it just depends on the compound that you're using, and obviously the intensity of the experience of the individual. But Haley, any other thoughts on that piece of, especially from a sponsor perspective, of what parameters do you put on some of the professionals or some of the co-facilitators that you're expecting to have from a sponsor perspective?
Yeah, well, from the sponsor perspective, you want to make it as easy as possible for the sponsor to work with you, right? So I do think that, and why I highlighted access to the population as being so important, which I think was reiterated by Morgan and Scott, and what the kind of inclusion criteria are that if a site has a full-time therapist, they're probably nested within a treatment clinic. And if you're nested within a treatment clinic as a research center, you have access to incredible records and a very documented population of who might be eligible for your study. So when I think about what sites are being most successful in terms of finding the right populations, it's those that are really tapped into centers of treatment, who are more likely to have those full-time therapists on staff. At this point, what are we going to be moving towards? Like, certainly in the commercial space, none of us really know. That could be a negotiation with the REMS. That could be some, like, eventually the licensing bodies and the professional associations of the kinds of folks that may be involved in this work will step in and create specific training programs for those types of roles. But right now we are operating, generally all the studies are operating within those guidelines that the FDA agreed upon with Lykos kind of back in the day. Like Scott said, they're moving towards having a second person maybe outside the room. But having so many people that are contract does lend itself to this kind of more challenging scheduling perspective, right? And making sure that everybody's done the proper training. And at this point, none of the sponsors are accepting one another's training. So even if someone's experienced on Compass or MindMed or Cybin, they're still going to have to go through an ATAI training. There is no one comprehensive training yet. So I think that is an area that may shift over time, but certainly from a sponsor's perspective, stable staff is always better.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are a lot of docs out there that wish there was some standardized training, because it seems like they're in training all the time. But a lot of times the training has to be very specific to that compound, to that particular the indication that they may be working on, and what psychedelic that they'll be taking, which is interesting because one of the biggest challenges obviously for sites is inclusion exclusion criteria. And I do want to step back real quick too. When we talk about training and co-facilitators, and I'm not speaking for all sponsors, but generally that's included in the budget, that that you have a budget set forth just for ensuring that those co-facilitators there all the way through the paid training and then into that co-facilitator. So, but that's usually built in the budget. So, when we look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria, I know for a lot of psychiatric trials, they're always looking at, can we back off on marijuana use? Can we back off on this and that? Are you seeing that maybe as we go forward that maybe there are fewer restrictions and we can open up the pool of patients a little bit broader? Is that happening, or do you have any thoughts on that?
I'll say I have not seen that happen.
Okay.
No.
I'll say I have. From the protocols that Lykos initially put forth, a lot of things shifted in terms of concomitant, substance use disorders. If they were mild to moderate to severe, still exclusionary. I think with the rise of access to legal cannabis, I do think that sponsors are reconsidering. Certainly, there's the propensity for attenuation of effect if someone is under the influence of other drugs at the time that they come in for dosing. And so that's still prohibited. Often people still have to have a clean or a negative urine drug screen, but I have seen a lot of shift in allowable use of other substances. And I think concomitant or comorbid conditions. Like I know we saw a little bit of movement on personality disorders, for example. because I think we do hear that these trial populations don't look anything like a standard PTSD or a standard MDD population that you'd see in clinical practice. And I think that obviously, as trials move from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, they always have to be broadening their scope. The goal of a phase 3 is to enroll a more representative population, right? You start with like the healthiest, you move to a safety and efficacy, and then you move to an efficacy, but you do have to consider what it would look like post-approval, because that could be a valid critique, right, by the regulators, that you've enrolled this population that looks nothing like what you're going to see in clinical practice. So I have seen some shifts.
Yeah. Good question though, and Morgan, I don't know if you touched on this or you might want to touch on it some more about the rater scales. I mean, how are we that was always the question people would always ask. You're doing psychedelics, but how do you tell if people are getting better? I mean, so what are some measurements that you guys put in place to, the scales and so forth for, that a lot of these folks are going to have to integrate into the studies and the work that they're doing at the site level?
Yeah, I think it depends on the indication for the trial, obviously. So with depression, the most common one I've seen is MADRS as the endpoint that we're measuring throughout the trial. And you might be using the HAM-D anxiety scale for an anxiety trial. So it really does depend on which indication you're looking at. I would say across the board, almost every single one has a CSSRS, because that seems to be one of the most concerning possible side effects for a lot of the sponsors. So we measure that at almost every visit. But across the board, it really depends on which indication you're measuring.
Mm-hmm. And anything to add to that, Dr. Fisher? Anything that you guys that you use, and this might kind of go right into another question that you guys could maybe delve into. Do the protocols, this is interesting, do any of the protocols include the dosing day session, like note-taking info? What are you looking for? What are you supposed to be noting? I mean, what is it that folks are going to be looking for the day that they're sitting with somebody who doses? I think that's a really great question. What is it that you're looking for?
Yeah, I would say like certainly not the main outcome measures don't have much to do with the narrative report that the therapist provides. And some sponsors really want it very minimal, it seems, and other sponsors do ask for a bit more detail. But I think something that's a challenge for a lot of facilitators who haven't worked on clinical trials previously is to track adverse events while simultaneously attending to other elements of kind of holding space or being a facilitator for these sorts of sessions. And the FDA is really interested in getting a broad swath of adverse events, including ones that most people might not think of as adverse, whether it's they're feeling happy or euphoric. What's the kind of barrier between euphoria and feeling happy? What's the difference between someone taking a nap because they're sleepy versus they're fatigued or sedated? This is, I think, an area that really needs a lot more attention right now in terms of tracking adverse events successfully. I don't think it's being done well at all right now, and I'm hoping there will be some changes there in the future. But obviously, if you start soliciting adverse events, you're gonna start getting many more reported that maybe wouldn't otherwise have been reported. How much as a facilitator do you want to interrupt someone's process to kind of really gauge what's happening with their adverse event? I think it's a really tricky situation.
Interesting. Haley, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Scott brings up a good point about if you ask, then you will drive up the numbers, right? And so there are solicited and unsolicited AEs, and like in prior drug trials, and I think that there were always lists of things people were looking for because maybe this compound had been approved for another indication. And so you can kind of go through the checklist of like, are people meeting kind of what we know to be the side effects with psychedelic trials, because there's both positive and negative elements. It's kind of bringing about this new era of measurement. A little bit like Scott was saying, like, so there's this new scale, new-ish Swiss psychedelic side effects inventory. So I've seen the SPSI be added, to try to measure some of these things that are happening in the moment. As Morgan mentioned, there are AESIs that are particular to every single protocol because they're particular to like that compound or what the company may have agreed with the FDA that they were going to track in particular. We're even seeing novel measures at baseline, like Stanford just put out this psychedelic media exposure questionnaire to try to quantify expectancy at the beginning of a trial, in addition to like the Stanford expectancy of treatment benefit, the expectancy of treatment scale. So I think that it's just launched a whole new way of examining how we look at drug effects.
You know, it's interesting because somebody had asked this question, Erica, and it was, it was kind of it was an afterthought, I think, Dr. Fisher, when you were talking about exclusionary criteria for those who've actually experienced this, had a psychedelic experience before. And can you talk maybe a bit more of why would that be an exclusionary criteria? And it would seem like that most people would be seeking this as therapy because at some point they've experienced a psychedelic experience, and they thought that there was something there. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that most of the reasons we heard tend to regard they may be unblinded because they've previously had the experience, so they know what that drug already feels like. Most people, the majority in most of these studies, do get functionally unblinded by the subjective experience of what they're given. Or they may already kind of have a bias towards this being helpful or not. So I think that's tends to be among the main reasons that they're excluded.
Yeah. And I would say most trials that I've worked on don't prohibit exposure to psychedelics across the board. Usually there's a time frame and the number of times that they've been exposed to a psychedelic within that time frame, like more than 6 times in the past 2 years or something like that. And I think a lot of it is also probably a reduction in effect. If you're doing this all the time, there's the possibility that you doing it for the trial is going to have a reduced effect than it would if you hadn't been exposed in the past 2 years.
Makes sense. Absolutely. Yeah. Those make complete sense. Jillian had a good question. And this is something that again may come back to you, Morgan, a bit. So scheduling between independent, central raters, facilitators, patients, it's a lot of work, right? So it's time consuming, and could it lead to protocol deviations? If there's too many variables, especially she says in one appointment, but any suggestions? Because if it is like juggling, I mean, or are there times that we can have protocol deviations because of the complexity of this?
So I would say first and foremost, find yourself a good juggler. Because you're gonna need it. It's unavoidable, and really try to find some of these tools you can use. If you don't have access to a management platform like Monday, I used to be the queen of spreadsheets. Use a spreadsheet, and we have live access across so many platforms, Google, Microsoft. There's so many ways to make that live. Inevitably, no matter how hard you try, there will be days and appointments that are protocol deviations. And most of the sponsors understand that. They know how many variables we are working with here to try and make these appointments work. So they do understand there's going to be some PDs that are due to scheduling. And they're not unreasonable about that. I can tell you I've not had really any single recollection come to mind of a sponsor that, gave us a hard time for those. It's just doing your best to have as few as possible and really driving home when you do work with those facilitators and with the patients how important it is to maintain those appointments.
Well, yeah. So here, and we're getting down just the last few minutes. As Scott said earlier, this is a topic we could probably all sit and talk about all afternoon because it is fascinating, and there's so many facets to it and a lot of variables in this area. But let's see, a couple of other ones. I think it's kind of interesting because I think people are fascinated by the dosing day, right? I mean, the dosing day seems to be the thing that everybody is really interested in. What is that all about? I did hear one time someone describe it at the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver a couple of years ago. Is that particular dosing day is like writing your name in wet concrete. Right. It is an experience that is not the end all be all. It's really the beginning of a much longer journey with therapy and with reflection, and that you can have that experience. But it is really everything that comes after that we're looking at growth and maybe some recovery in some different areas. But this was a question. So how regimented are those dosing days? Right. I mean, so Do they require specific discussions? Is there music? Is there anything else? I mean, is it kind of a what that patient may want for a comfort? Is it pretty highly regulated? What does that look like on a dosing day for that patient? And are there some requirements there that you expect?
Yeah, I think I could probably talk to this. So almost every study requires some level of preparation between facilitator and participant. That can be as little as 60 minutes to up to 8 hours of preparation in advance. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in the amount of preparation that occurs. And, building rapport is one of the main aspects, but there's also a number of other kind of very regimented parts that need to be addressed in the preparation sessions. And more sponsors are choosing to either audio and or audio video record all of the sessions between facilitators and participants, and also track whether they're following what's asked done, whether the facilitators are doing what's asked to be done in the manual. So there is a fair amount of regimented aspects of, I would say, the preparation and the follow-up or integration sessions. The dosing day itself certainly has, regimented aspects often at the start of the dosing day. But otherwise, the dosing days, the requirement is that the participant stays in the room. There's often a musical playlist that's been selected that's being played. They're offered food at a certain point if they're hungry. But it's otherwise a pretty open space, just as long as they stay in the room and keep themselves safe.
All right. Anything else to add, Haley or Morgan? Fascinating. It is such a fascinating discussion, and I look. Thank you guys. If you look over in the chat, people have suggested a couple of books. One included Embark Method by Alex Bessler and Bill Brennan. It's a comprehensive information about psychedelics and depression. Also a couple of links that you can go to maybe learn a little bit more about this. Again, I think that maybe in a quick summary, there are a lot of dynamics to psychedelic research. From what I have noticed, that a lot of sponsors are looking for sites that private sites, because they're agile, they can move quick, they can really build, especially those that may have, and most of the people that are on the STAR Coalition that are part of the STAR Coalition have a psychiatric background experience with working with patients, but I think that ability to fast track, move forward, really can, get moving on a trial, and all that deep experience that most of you guys carry with all the studies you've done before is ripe to work in this particular sector. Yes, you have to have a dosing room. There are some things that you move through the continuum, but look, it's really not is more difficult than doing an inpatient, a psychiatric trial, or even a long-term, major depressive disorder, whatever it may be. There are complexities to every study. But if this is something you're really interested in looking at, look further into it. And I know that our panelists today would be happy to speak to you. Reach out to the STAR Coalition. They would be happy to connect you with others who are either beginning this journey or have a seasoned, a deep field of psychedelic knowledge in this particular area. But exciting time to get involved. I think that more and more you're hearing this talked about as a way that people can heal. I think that I don't want to say that there's a complete healing here, but I think that there has been so much positive movement and outcomes here that I think this is opening up a whole new space for the future. And I wish you all the best of luck in the work that you're doing out in the research side of it, and also with the sponsors who are also navigating a very complex field of building out new compounds and looking at ways that they can help develop new products for folks. So, and then insurance too as well. I mean, there's a lot of stuff down the line. We got to be sure that people have access to this as well once these things get approved. So thank you, Dr. Fisher. Appreciate it. Again, Dr. Fisher working at Siegel Trials there in Fort Lauderdale. Haley Gilmore, and she is working with the Thai Therapeutics. So please seek out more information about a Thai, and Morgan Hecker, which is at Synexcel. And thank you for your work there at iResearch Atlanta and all the work you guys are doing at CenExcel. You guys have a great group of folks across the nation. So thank you guys again. If you have any questions, reach out to the STAR Coalition. We really appreciate your time today, and thank you guys so much. What an incredible discussion. I've learned a lot, and I hope you guys have too that have joined us. So thank you, and have a great week. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.